So,
if you don't know what the English Catholic History Association is, we've got an excellent website and a timeline on it. I recommend it. The timeline goes from Roman period up to present time. Lots of articles written by lots of scholars on various periods of English Catholic history. I've written on 2 of them anyway, but not many of them. But I'm working on one at the minute, which will go on the timeline as well. And we're on Facebook, we're on X, we're on LinkedIn, we're on all sorts of social media stuff. So it's well worth seeing. Anyway, the talk this evening is on St. Nicholas Owen, priest-hide builder. And he's an interesting saint. And there's some things obviously we do know about him, and a lot we don't know about him, because he worked in secret, he worked on his own, and so forth. So he was a very important figure at the time, but he was more like sort of backstage, really, more than anything else. There's an excellent book here I recommend on St. Nicholas Owen, priest hole maker, although I always call them priest hides. I never call them holes because I think it sounds like a hobbit or something of that sort. The primary evidence that we know about Nicholas Owen comes primarily from 2 sources, and one of them is a diary of an Elizabethan priest, which does have quite a bit about him, and the other is letters from Father Garnet to Aquaviva, who was the superior of the Jesuits in Rome. And for example, this is a letter Henry Garnet wrote to Aquaviva in 1596. We maintain a number of necessary lay helpers, and among them a carpenter. Sometime, God willing, he will join the society. His singular faithfulness and skill make him most suited for its work. He had travelled almost the entire kingdom, and without charge has made for the Catholic priests hiding places where they can shelter from the fury of heretical searchers. So we know from these letters to Aquaviva, which have survived, a little bit about Nicholas Owen. And John Gerard's book as well, his diary as well. The Diary of an Elizabethan Priest was published in 1951, translated from the Latin by Father Philip Caraman. And it's an excellent book, because it's primary evidence about what it was like being a priest, and this particular priest escaped from the Tower of London with the help of Nicholas Owen, almost certainly with the help of Nicholas Owen as well. But we know that he was a very small man. He had limp because he fell off a horse and his leg was broken and set badly. He also had a hernia as well, sort of problems with that. So that's kind of a little bit about that. Now, start with a question really. What would it be like if somebody prescribed your faith and stopped you going to church, stopped you receiving the sacraments, baptising your children and so on? How would you feel?
Excellent.
I expect you'd be devastated, upset. This is the situation that many Catholics found themselves in at the time, during the reign of Elizabeth I and James I as well. It wasn't everywhere, and it wasn't all the time either. It varied from time to time, depending on who was in control, all sorts of local issues, depending on who you bribed, who the local landowners were, all sorts of things. For example, the local families, Catholic family where I live, the farmer family, I've found no evidence of persecution of them. And they definitely hid priests, because in the village where I live, the priest hide was found about 1850 or 1851 in a manor house in the loft space, which may or may not have been by Nicholas Owen. The hide has now disappeared in renovations and extensions in the 19th century, but it was recorded at the time. So there were many of these priest hides all over the country, and they've been digitally mapped as well, the known ones and the sort of suggested ones and so on. I don't know what you know also about persecution of Catholics at that time, but I just sort of run through a little bit of introduction without going into too much detail anyway. Obviously, Queen Mary was a Catholic, 1553. She died in 1557. Elizabeth becomes queen. The people welcomed Mary when she became queen. They were very happy that Edward's reign was over and the sort of terrible things that went on with churches and things, and iconoclasm during that reign. But then obviously Mary couldn't stop Elizabeth becoming queen. That was just the way it happened. And Elizabeth obviously was not a Catholic, although she was, of course, baptized a Catholic. So Elizabeth became queen. The thing that really did it for Catholics was Regnans in Excelsis, reigning on high, which the Vatican decided was a great idea to tell Catholics in England that they no longer owed allegiance to Elizabeth and that she was a heretic, could be overthrown and so on. And this was red rag to the authorities. And unfortunately it had a lot of implications for the Catholics. So following Regnans in Excelsis 1570, things got worse for Catholics. They were much more, the authorities feared them, they thought they were treasonous, traitors and various things of that sort. And various acts of parliament followed. 1570, 1581, Act of Persuasions. Basically, they wanted to try and persuade people not to be Catholics. And of course, recusancy was a spectrum. It wasn't binary at all. It was completely a spectrum. It was, some went along with it, some didn't go along, some refused to go to church, were heavily fined and so on. There was lots in between. Sometimes the men went to the church because the men could be fined, the women couldn't be fined because it wouldn't regard as having any money, because the men had control of the money, so you couldn't fine the women. It was a strange anomaly of the law at that time. So people played games with the authorities. Sometimes they went to church, sometimes they didn't. You know, they went a bit, they could sort of get away with it, and all sorts of things. Anyway, 1581 was also Edmund Campion's execution as well, first Jesuits execution. 1585, acts against papists. So they were really tightening the screws, and they were fining people who refused to go to church. People who went to church, they would write down the names of them, the church wardens, and if they weren't there, names would be passed on to the courts and the church courts for fines. 1586, the Harleyford Manor Conference was where Catholic landowners got together and thought, how on earth can we arrange for these priests to say Mass and celebrate sacraments? So the Harleyford Manor Conference was a turning point. It's a secret conference of landowners, and they basically organised the passage of priests between these various different houses up and down the country, from the south coast up to Lancashire and so on, sort of secretly passing one to the other. And the women were very much central to this. And this talk isn't about Catholic women, but I've done talks on Catholic women at this period, and it's very, very important. I feel very strongly about women being front and centre of Catholic history, or any history, but for that matter at all. But anyway, the Harleyford Manor Conference meant that the priests could be, but the priests had to be hidden. So the priests had to under cover of darkness and various things, or disguises and so on. And they had to be hidden in the houses, because the authorities quickly cottoned on that the priests go to these houses, and they knew where the papists were. So it's a question of like, let's get some information and raid those houses. So at first the priest hides were actually very primitive, very simple and easily found. But Nicholas Owen was the person who kind of made it much, much better, because he was a skilled carpenter. 1588, the Spanish Armada. It had a very bad effect on Catholics as well, because they were regarded as Spanish agents and all sorts of things as well. 1593, Act restraining recusants. Again, there were more legislation to try to limit them. They were not allowed to travel more than 5 miles from their place of abode without good reason, an excuse, and permission from a magistrate and so on. But anyway, cometh the hour, cometh the man, and Nicholas Owen was kind of the person. So that kind of gives you a bit of a background, hopefully, about that. So the authorities began to launch unannounced raids on the homes of known Catholic sympathisers, obviously the Catholic families who were hiding them. This often involved priest hunters, known as pursuivants, measuring the footprint of the house from the outside and the inside to see if they tallied. They would count the windows outside and again from the inside, seeing whether there was any kind of anomalies there. They would tap on the walls to see if they were hollow, so they would bring with them some poles and sticks and various things and measuring devices and so on. And they would tear up floorboards and panelling off walls and all sorts of things. And the families who were raided had to pay for it. They had to pay for the damage. They had to pay for the privilege of the pursuivants wrecking their house and pay them to go away. So it cost them a lot of money. And sometimes they had to feed them as well and give them lots of beer. And sometimes they gave them so much beer that they just forgot what they were actually meant to be doing, which was fortunate in at least one case where a priest was hidden in a priest hide which was under a fireplace, and the fireplace had a wooden hearth. And they thought, that's very odd. A wooden hearth at fire, that doesn't make sense. They thought, well, look at that tomorrow. And then they forgot all about it. The priest was there inside. Another tactic would be for the pursuivants to pretend to leave or quickly return to see if the priest would then emerge from the hiding place. So they'd go and then come back, an hour later or whatever. It was another of their games. So sometimes the landowners would travel with them and go, I'll see you to the main road. We'll make sure you get on your way. In other words, they just check that they're actually going. And things like that. Once detected and captured, the priests could expect to be imprisoned, tortured, and put to death. That was basically what happened to most of them. One of the priests who was arrested near Oxford was Father Edmund Campion, who you'll know about. He was now a saint. At this time, one of Campion's servants, an Oxford-born carpenter and joiner, who abandoned his apprenticeship at that time, went back to it afterwards, to follow Campion, was present at his arrest, according to Matthias Tanner, in his book on Jesuit martyrs published in 1675. This is in Reynolds' St. Nicholas Owen, which is this book here, actually, is mentioned in page 25. Whether or not this is accurate, what we do know is that Nicholas Owen, who joined the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits, as a lay brother, or they think he was a lay brother anyway, went on to construct the best examples of priest hides in England. It's impossible to know how many priest hides were constructed and where they were, because there was no written records for obvious reasons. And oral records was all they had. So nobody knows for certain which ones he did. We know some of them. Harvington Hall is the best examples. We know he created those. So, and there are other ones, Braddock's in East Anglia and Essex, for example, and various other places. But nobody knows for absolute certain where he went. He travelled widely across the country, up to Lancashire, Yorkshire, and so on. He travelled with aliases as well. Sometimes he was called Little John or other names. The authorities didn't know quite who he was, but he was essentially a servant to the priests anyway. So he was a backroom guy, but he was a carpenter. We know that some of the hiding places in the English Midlands have been attributed to Nicholas Owen, who devoted the greater part of his life to constructing these places to protect the lives of persecuted priests. Undoubtedly, he saved the lives of quite a number as well. With incomparable skills, Owen knew how to conduct priests to a place of safety along secret passages, to hide them between walls and in hidden recesses. With great ingenuity, he so disguised the entrances so as to make them most unlike what they really were. Unsurprisingly, he kept these places so close a secret they were never disclosed to another, the place of concealment of any Catholic, let alone an agent of the Crown. And remember, they tortured him as well. They got no information other than what they already knew. And he died under torture. They said that he'd committed suicide. He didn't. He died because of a hernia injury, the torture. And they were very embarrassed about it and tried to cover it up with the authorities. He alone was both their architect and their builder, and their location was secret. One thing is certain, Owen's skillfully crafted priest hides saved many lives during the period of religious turmoil and persecution. So it kind of gives you the kind of background, the desperate situation that they suffered from. I won't read all that, so I'll let you read it yourself. Little John was one of his monikers, that or names that he thought up, or people called him by. So often he didn't even use his real name. When he did work, he worked at night, he worked on his own as well, by candlelight. He seemed to have an incredible ability to think almost in 3D, to sort of think, right, this space has got potential. I could build a hide here, behind the fireplace, underneath the stairs, in various places. Or if you move that wall there, this wall here, I can actually create a hide behind it. And Harvington Hall is the best one anyway. So he was injured, falling off a horse, so he had a limp. So he was a small man with a hernia and with a limp. Most improbable hero, really. This is a sort of supposed picture of Guy Fawkes, but it's not really. It's a much later picture. It just gives you a sort of idea of sort of people in prison and so on, and what it must have been like. And this is a supposed picture. This is only 19th century picture, I think, of supposed sort of Guy Fawkes. Anyway, the person on the this is from Gunpowder. The person on the left there, Walsingham was my best man, and he's an interesting actor. So he's been in a few films and TV things and that sort of thing. So I just thought I'd put that picture in because it's quite a nice picture, really. Anyway, anyways, why do Catholic priests need these claustrophobic hiding places. Well, it kind of explains there really what I've said already. And they were incredibly claustrophobic. Some of them were very small, some of them were larger. Mostly they were behind walls. They were rarely underneath floors. Occasionally they were, like underneath the fireplace, or in the sewer system, in the case of one of the houses. But mostly they were sort of behind fireplaces, behind stairs, and all sorts of things of that sort, really. Some had a close stool, in other words, like a bucket for sanitary purposes. Some had food in them, some didn't. Some recipes had to rush into them at like 10 minutes' notice. There's a wonderful story, actually, of one of the raids by pursuivants on one of the Catholic homes. And it was the wife fainted, and the little girl, who was aged about 10, said to the pursuivants, "Put up your swords, my mother cannot abide naked swords." And they obeyed her. They did what this little girl told them, to put their swords away. And then she said, "Right, I have to get something for my mother now, so I will be gone for a few minutes." So she rushed upstairs where the priest was and hid him, and the priest hid, and then came down. She later became a nun, actually. But, I mean, amazing bravery, even of children, to do this sort of thing. So, you know, you have to sort of pay tribute to the women and the girls for what their part as well in all this. So, reign of Elizabeth I, then, the Church of England was re-established. It was Protestant, it was definitely not Catholic, and Catholics obviously had a dilemma. Some were sort of taunted with, like, are you loyal to the Queen? Are you loyal to Spain? Are you an enemy? Are you a traitor? Are you treasonous? And all sorts of things. And the penalty for treason, of course, is horrific death, so not very nice. So, Catholics, sundry wicked and seditious persons, apparently so, who terming themselves Catholics, and being indeed spies and intelligences, you get the idea, not only for Her Majesty's foreign enemies, but also for rebellious and traitorous subjects. You get the idea, basically, they were the enemy. They were, because of the threat from Catholic Spain especially, it was part political, part religious. Now, Queen Elizabeth sort of said, I've got no problems with Catholics, whatever, as long as they're not disloyal. But it wasn't as simple as that at all. And most of these Catholics were loyal to the Queen. They absolutely were, and even priests on the scaffold would say that I'm loyal to the Queen and pray to the Queen and so on. But it was a perceived treason and perceived sort of enemy of the state type of thing. But also some people in the council actually hated Catholics anyway, and some used it as a way of persecuting Catholics because they just hated Catholics full stop. There's a mixture of different things going on really. But anyway, do secretly wander and shift from place to place. You get the idea of them being all spies moving around, and actually the priests, some of them were. And obviously they moved from house to house, from these big houses, but they also moved from town to town. Some pubs and inns were very useful places for priests to stay because they could pretend to be a traveller. The Mitre pub in the High Street in Oxford was a great place for mass as well. You could have mass in the basement of that. And it was a known meeting place for Catholics in Oxford, for example. There's a very nice pub now. So Elizabethan law, every person shall receive, relieve, comfort, aid or maintain any such Jesuit, seminary priest or other such priest shall be adjudged a felon and suffer death, loose and forfeit as in case of high treason. So, and that's from Dodd's Church History of England and so on. So you get the idea of the high stakes. So Nicholas Owen was the son of an Oxford carpenter, and he grew up in the shadow of Oxford Castle. He was small of stature, but a very practical person. So he didn't have learned skills, reading, writing, and that sort of thing. He used his hands. So he served an apprenticeship, and he became a kind of, a master carpenter, basically, really. And he stayed loyal to the church. It was basically what he could do for the church as well. And his younger brother became a printer and printed Catholic books, and was imprisoned in the Clink prison on the South Bank. And in fact, actually, even in the Clink prison, he managed to get a printing press into his cell. And you think, well, how on earth could he do that? Well, because people were bribed, you see. So he had a printing press going on in his cell at the Clink prison. That was Nicholas Owen's brother. So bribery could get you all sorts of things, especially in the Clink, really. People could come, and some of the letters and things were being taken back and forth by visitors and so on as well. and they weren't being searched. But again, money was changing hands, so it's kind of like, all right. And a lot of the people had sympathy for these priests. A lot of the people were very sympathetic, and so Elizabeth had difficulty keeping people's loyalty, really. So there we are. This is meant to be a picture of Nicholas Owen, but of course it may well not be because it was done afterwards, so we don't actually know what he looked like, really. But anyway, it's a picture which is meant to be Nicholas Owen, but obviously it isn't. It's just a sketch, really. It's of somebody. Owen, always working alone at night, was a master of concealment. A good example of his work could be seen at Harvington Hall. They're the best ones you could go to. If you've ever been to Harvington Hall, you'll know what I mean. So there on the staircase is the one step that, if pressed to a certain angle, opens an entrance to a small room in which someone with enough food and water could stay for weeks. And that's one of a number at Harvington Hall. And Harvington was never raided by the pursuivants. Many other places were, but it wasn't. That one wasn't. So they were just lucky, I guess, really. So yeah, he was first arrested in 1582, and he was put in prison, and then he sort of was let out again afterwards. After his release, he managed to evade arrest until 1594. This time he was tortured, but revealed nothing of his work. So he was quite an amazing character, really. So Father Campion's arrest at Life at Grange, south of Oxford, had a real influence on him and made him determined to serve the Jesuits as their servant and work for them as much as he could. And his brother John was imprisoned in the Marshalsea and in the Clink prison as well, as a printer. So anyway, a hiding place is a place of concealment for the Catholics. It's not always easy to discover which priests stayed at particular houses before the reign of Charles I. There are no written records, basically. And we do have John Gerard's book, but not much else to go on. The exception being Hindlip House. Priests were known to visit the homes of recusants, but also church papists or even a few Protestants. People played the games, and sometimes people said they were Protestants when they weren't Protestants. I mean, Margaret Clitheroe's husband was nominally Protestant and was meant to inform what the Catholics were doing in York, but his own wife was hiding priests in their own house. So he can't not have known that he was playing double games, really, with the authorities. Few documents have survived, and little incriminating evidence would have been recorded for fear of falling into the wrong hands. The existing priest hides or historical mentions of them are clues about what was happening. There could not be said to be one Catholic community, but a network of many different Catholic communities, and these were split between recusants, church papists, and sympathisers of various sorts. It could be that there were connections through marriage, kinship, or education at Oxford between the owner and some other houses in which Nicholas Owen worked. In the Diocesan Returns of Papists 1603, a figure of 8,590 recusants was estimated. Completely imaginary figure, they just thought of a number. They had absolutely no clue who was a Catholic, who wasn't a Catholic, or what sort of Catholic, or where they were. They just thought of a number and said, that's a number, but it was a complete random number. John Bossy, in one of his books, estimates that this figure, including non-communicants and church papists, plus an estimate for inefficiently in recording, as he put it, as well as children, might come to a total of 39,372. So, completely different figure that John Bossy comes up with. The mission of Nicholas Owen was to aid the Jesuits and the seminary priest in any way he could, given his abilities and station in life. He acted as a servant for the priests such as Edmund Campion, John Gerard, and Father Henry Garnet. In addition, he used his carpentry and joinery skills to build hiding places for these priests and their mass equipment. So not only did you have to hide the priests, but also the vestments and all the rest of the things, chalices and so forth. Around the time of the Spanish Armada, 1588, priest hides were often poorly constructed and easily found. In that year, 17 priests were put to death by the authorities, and the situation was desperate. So basically, priests didn't have a hope until Nicholas Owen comes along and actually builds high-quality places, really. Edmund Campion, supposed picture of Edmund Campion again, it's just a sketch sort of thing that who knows what he actually looked like, really. So that's basically the situation that was going on anyway. Following the Acts of Uniformity in 1559 and subsequent legislation, the situation looked bleak. The Catholic cause was still said to be strong in Oxford, which may account for Nicholas Owen's strong faith. So there were many Catholics, and Blessed George Napier, for example, who was caught near Oxford, for example, was a priest in Oxford and executed in Oxford. And at his trial in Oxford, he offered to make the judge and jury and so forth into Catholics as well, which enraged them even more. And basically they said, right, well, he's a goner, and they executed him. So I mentioned the Harleyford Manor conference, which is near Marlow as well, which was a major turning point for Nicholas Owen and for the hiding of priests. So there's a bit more information there about what they were and so on, and how Nicholas Owen kind of played his part, really. So tells you a little bit more about him there. The work of Little John in particular is particularly impressive when one considers that he was of diminutive size and walked with a limp after his leg was broken following an accident. He also had a hernia, but none of this prevented him from working alone and in secret, usually at night, to break down stone walls, reconstruct them in such a way as to create secret places that were almost impossible to find if you did not know where to look. And remember, at the time many of them were never found. We know about them afterwards, like Harvington, but some of them were very ingenious and very cleverly constructed. He made false entrances to fireplaces and staircases, trapdoors, sliding doors, and in one case at Speke Hall near Liverpool, a crawl space above a ceiling accessed by a rope ladder to a small space at the side of a bedroom. He is said to have favoured sights away from outside walls and seems to have had the ability to think in 3 dimensions and in curves. Owen's favoured locations seem to have been behind fireplaces and under stairs, though. To provide cover for his principal work of constructing priest hides, Owen would always engage himself with other obvious works. So he would pretend to be people would say, he's the builder, he's visiting, he's doing some building work at our house. Not to letting on he was actually building a priest hide. So he would actually do building work by day and then work by night, and somehow sleep and rest in between, only conducting the real work at night. This must have been exhausting, not to mention that he would generally work unaided and would be engaged in substantial physical work, and he also took no payment for it either. He had board and lodgings and a bit of money, but he essentially wasn't paid for it. Whilst the hides were built by others, were often simple trapdoors or hidden doors covered with furnishings or other floor coverings, Owen's constructions are recognised because of the ingenuity of the construction. There's a supposed picture of Henry Garnet as well, the superior of the Jesuits in England, anyway. And it's his letters to Aquaviva in Rome that we know about Nicholas Owen. John Gerard, whose Diary of Elizabethan, recommend it if you haven't read it, gives you a lot of evidence about what went on, hiding in priest hides, what it was like for a priest at the time, his torture in the Tower of London, and his escape from the Tower of London, because he was the only priest who ever escaped from the Tower of London with the aid of Nicholas Owen and a rope. The pursuivants employed craftsmen who would judge if an interior wall looked shorter than an exterior wall. So Owen had to be very careful as to where he located the priest hides. He used false perspectives and illusion, now more often employed by stage magicians to hide the priest hide. So think of him like a stage magician almost, really, or something of that sort. Some priests were discovered and arrested, but many more escaped detection thanks to the ingenuity and skill of this man. The hiding places at Harvington in Worcestershire are the finest surviving examples in England, with 4 of them, all sited round the great staircase, showing the trademark of Owen, the master builder. He was known to have stayed there around 1588. Baddesley Clinton in Warwickshire, we'll see some pictures in a minute, was a safe house for Catholic priests and home of the Jesuit priest Henry Garnet for almost 14 years. Sometimes the priest would pretend to be something else. At Tusmore, which is near where I live, the Jesuit was officially the gardener, and one of the things he did was dig a lake. By day he was the gardener, in the evening he was a priest saying mass. But people must have known this. People must have had some inkling about it. They couldn't not have known it. It too boasts several priest hides built by Nicholas Owen. One hiding place is just 114 centimetres high. Is in the roof space above a closet off a bedroom. Another is in the corner of the kitchen where visitors to the house today can see through the medieval drain where Father Garnet was hidden. And that's well worth seeing, actually. You can't actually kind of look into it. They won't kind of let you, but it is there anyway. Access to this hiding place was through a garderobe shaft in the floor of the room above. So basically, it was a garderobe, it was a toilet, but they blocked it off, so it wasn't a toilet. But basically, the authorities would think it was. So a hiding place beneath the library floor was accessed through the fireplace in the great parlour. They were sometimes built as an offshoot from a chimney. Another favourite entrance was behind panelling, such as Ripley Castle in North Yorkshire. Others were adapted from garderobes, for example at Chesterton Hall near Cambridge, and other places were known. Examples of the priest hides were Oxborough Hall, Norfolk, Coaton Court, Battersea Clinton, both of Warwickshire, Houghton Tower in Lancashire. One priest hide was only discovered after an electrician fell into it, so in the 20th century. And at Ashley Hall, Chorley in Lancashire, a priest hide was discovered as recently as 2004. So they have turned them up in the last few years occasionally. There is evidence that Owen also stayed at Sawston Hall and Huddington Court in Worcestershire. Worcestershire was really a hotbed of the Papists. Father John Jerrod describes borrowing Little John, as Owen was sometimes known, from Father Garnet, to a house in order to construct hides along with a man called Hugh Sheldon. First thing in the morning, the searchers arrived, Sheldon was arrested, and Owen managed to slip away unnoticed. So there were other people building them as well. He wasn't the only person. There was a man, I've forgotten, he had a nickname, who was from the Oxford area, who also built them, but nobody knows his real name, and nobody knows which ones. So there were lots and lots and lots of them, basically. So here are some kind of the mentions of some of the places anyway. And some of these you can still see today. So, but some of them have been lost long since as well. The authorities continued to search for Catholic priests up and down the country. These searches could go on for ages, sometimes for days as well. Surprisingly, there's no record of Harvington Hall ever being searched, though, which is quite incredible, really. The centre of the operations for hiding priests in Worcestershire and the Welsh Marches was Hindlip Hall. The house no longer exists. It was burnt down, I think, in the 18th century or something of that sort. And it's West Mercia Police Headquarters now on the site, strangely enough. But that was a wonderful Tudor house with lots of priest hides there. The home of Humphrey's friend Thomas Habington, where the Jesuit Edward Alcorn arrived in 1590. Although Hindlip was demolished in 1814, was demolished, descriptions of the hides were there show a striking similarity to those that survive at Harvington. So Hindlip must have had some wonderful Nicholas Owen priest hides. That it is unlikely to be an accident. It was there that Garnet, Owen and Alcorn were captured in 1606, just after the Gunpowder Plot. So basically, during the reign of Elizabeth, James I, and the Gunpowder Plot 1605, things got hotter and hotter for Catholics, really, for obvious reasons. Apparently the walls of the mansion were riddled with secret chambers and passages. There was little fear of them being run to earth, with hidden exits everywhere. So they must have thought wainscoting, solid brickwork or stone hearth were used as possible places to hide a priest. Tensions were highlighted because of the failed plot. The authorities were out to get as many Catholic sympathisers as they could. We all know about the story of Guy Fawkes. I personally think it's highly likely that the authorities knew all about the plot long before it was discovered under Parliament House, because I don't think they could have not known, because you can't get 39 barrels of gunpowder, which of course was meant to be in the ownership of the government under the House of Parliament, and nobody knew anything about it. So I am certain, and I've written an article about Guy Fawkes before, I think they knew. I think they let it run in order to round up as many people as possible, but I can't prove it. The house was surrounded anyway by 100 men at daybreak on Monday, the 20th of November. The searchers began to rip the house apart. Owen may have been starved out of his own hide on the fourth day of a 12-day search. to 12 days, basically, they didn't give up, during which he and a companion, Ralph Ashley, had nothing to eat except one apple between them for the number of days that they were in there. They seem to have been discovered, though, creeping along a gallery, possibly to distract attention from the two priests, Father Garnet and Father Alcorn, who were hiding in a different hide. So either they were trying to escape and mingle with the servants and sort of escape, or they gave themselves up in order to pursuivants sort of give up and think, oh, they've got all the people they want. They didn't know how Nicholas Owen was at first at all. But anyway, the other two priests were in a different hide. After 8 days, the priests were found and also arrested. There would be no escape for Nicholas Owen. Father Alcorn and Ralph Ashley were later executed, as you can imagine, basically. There's some more of the places as well, possibly. There's a wonderful book by Hodgetts on priest hides as well. And so there are lots of places suggested anyway, but nobody knows for certain exactly which ones. So actually there were. Anyway, Coton Court, there is a priest hide in one of these two towers, I can't remember which one, and I went there a little while ago and they said, do you think this one could be Nicholas Owen? I said, no, I don't think so, it's far too easy to find, because it's sort of in the floor of a room here, sort of like a trap door, and it's just like so obvious. But there was another range of buildings that you can't see because it was knocked down 200 years ago, and I think there were priest hides in this building that was here, it was like a quadrangle. I think there were priest hides there because we definitely know that Nicholas Owen was there, and we definitely know there were priests there. So it's extremely likely anyway. So it's, well, if you haven't been to Coton Court, I recommend it as well. So Coton has a double hide. This means it has 2 compartments. So if anyone opened the first one, they'd think, there's nobody in it, because they're in the second part. Basically, there's part 1 and part 2. So this is how clever Nicholas Owen was. He'd throw them off by having false hides, and hides that were easy to find, and they'd think, oh, well, we found these ones that can't be anybody else, and yet there was. So he was a master of ingenuity and creative ability to do these things. And he kind of thought, right, what are the pursuivants looking for? How can I fool them? How can I trick them? This is Baddesley Clinton, another place that priests hid out as well. And there was a raid. This is where there's one underground, basically in the old sewer there. And there was a raid on it at about 5 or 6 in the morning, because somebody tipped them off. There was a meeting of, I think, 9 Jesuits that over a couple of days, and somebody must have snitched, because early in the morning there was a raid on the house, and the lady who was renting the house was so terrified. Her sister said, right, well, I'll pretend to be you. So she sort of came to the door and remonstrated with them and argued with them and so on. So that's the Brooksby sisters. Anyway, so Baddesley Clinton then, this house offered sanctuary to Catholics, priests fleeing persecution. There are three priest hides there. So we know that Nicholas Owen constructed some or all of those as well. Harvington, of course, where there's a number. This is only, the Harvington Hall was much bigger at one time. Quite a lot of it was demolished. So there probably were other priest hides as well in the buildings that were actually demolished. But you'll see it's a higgledy-piggledy thing of different buildings at different times. So basically, each generation had a little bit more, and a little bit more, a little bit more, and it kind of altered. So you have bits here, and then there's another bit there, and so on, and loads of chimneys. And it was a brilliant warren of holes and hides and things to hide people in. So it was an amazing place. And of course, it's owned by Birmingham Archdiocese now, so it's well worth visiting. They have a history festival there each year as well in June. And sometimes they have talks on recusancy and priests and so on. I went to a day there on secrecy and subterfuge, and it was all about hiding the priests and so on in Elizabethan England. It was a fascinating talk, really, there. Anyway, this is Harvington, cross-sectional diagram. So this is kind of what was in Nicholas Owen's mind. He would sort of look at a building and go, right, okay, where can I put a hide? I could build one here and here. So there's a hide here, for example, and this bit here, and there's a hide here as well. So he was just a master of ingenuity, and he was thinking, right, where can I put one? Maybe put one. Oh, there's one up there as well. Put one up there as well. So he would have several, and if the pursuit, and remember, the pursuits never raided this actual house, But if they had, they might have found one. I doubt they would have found all of them. Not unless they were there for about a week or more searching for them. So you can see how sort of clever and ingenious this man really is. Anyway, Owen once had a very narrow escape at Stoke Poges while engaged in constructing priest hides at the manor house. The house, like many such houses, was secluded, because they were mainly in secluded places. That was the beauty of they were secluded places, countryside around, and they could kind of get away with having mass and so on, away from the eyes of the authorities, really.
Yeah.
The walls were very thick and offered lots of opportunities for Owen. Whilst he was busily burrowing into the masonry, a search party arrived, but somehow or other he slipped between their fingers and got away under cover of surrounding woods. Somehow he escaped some sort of back door, exit, whatever, disappeared into the woods around and away, which was something he was very good at. But again, he wasn't fast moving. He was a small man with a limp, so he probably struggled to get away quickly. But anyway, in April 1594, John Gerard narrowly avoided being caught while hiding in a priest hide hidden under a grate in a fireplace. The house was searched, but the searchers did not notice the cunning wooden trapdoor under the grate. The hide, as he claimed, was constructed by Owen. According to records, they noticed the hearth was wood and thought, this is very peculiar, we'll look at this in the morning, and then forgot all about it. 1594, John Gerard and Nicholas Owen were arrested at a house in Holborn, London, and afterwards he was interrogated by the authorities. It seems that someone raised the money to buy his release from the paltry compter or counter. The compter or counter was run by the local sheriff, in the case of the City of London, for example. And it was a money-making concern, actually. They had to make a profit, and they were open to bribery, and often they were, not very secure either. So they were almost like a private prison run by the sheriff, usually, where he was imprisoned. And after his release, Owen was able to visit the Clink prison. The Clink was on the south bank, and was actually relatively comfortable compared with some other places, where his brother and Gerard were held. A letter from Henry Garnet to his superior, Aquaviva, in Rome, mentions a carpenter who travelled, which is the quote I gave you at the beginning, I think, there anyway, so I won't reread it anyway. Nicholas Owen was also credited with planning, possibly with others, a daring escape of Father John Gerard and another Catholic, John Arden, from the Tower of London. And this was highly embarrassing for the authorities. They've got this priest, they've tortured him, they've hung him for hours by his wrists, hours on end, and then he'd faint, and they'd bring him round and they'd hang him up again. This happened over days and days, terrible torture. So his hands were in a bad state. But to lose him was pretty bad. Anyway, this is an example of High Priest Hide at Harvington, wooden trapdoor basically, going underground, this particular one. This is Braddock's near Thaxted in Essex. And you can see typical Tudor chimneys and so on. So this is a house that survives today. It's in private hands, but some people have been allowed to go and have a look at the priest hides there, but it is owned by a family, so it's not open to the general public, really. So this is basically the Tower of London anyway, obviously. They were being held in one of the towers by means of bribery and cunning, they were able to meet up. The plan was to rescue them from the roof of the Cradle Tower. And the Cradle Tower was basically right on the edge of the Tower of London, sort of near the river. It wasn't a very secure place to keep the priest, really. By means of a rope strung between the moat from the roof of the tower. After a failed first attempt to manoeuvre a boat into position, so the first night basically they tried to get the priest from the tower, Cradle Tower, onto a boat. The boat collided with the pier of the bridge, I believe, or hit the side or something. Anyway, but it didn't work, so they said, we'll do it again tomorrow night. The signal for the people in the tower was wearing a white piece of paper or a piece of cloth on their chest. It was sort of a sign to them, really. Anyway, so waiting again until they had been locked in the tower together, Gerard and Arden climbed onto the roof. Throwing down a weighted cord, they raised up a rope that had been tied to it by the rescuers below. The plan had been to slide down the rope, but the rope angle of it meant that instead the escapers had to pull themselves hand over hand along the length of it. And this was a priest who had been tortured, so had been hung up by his wrists for hours on end, so his hands must have been quiet state, but luckily he didn't drop off the road. Given that the priest had been tortured by the authorities, it's amazing he didn't fall in the process of escaping. Father Gerard was later smuggled out of England to the Low Countries, and from there made his way to Rome, where he died. And he was encouraged to write his story in Latin, which is the one that's translated by Philip Carrum in 1951. And that's primary evidence about Nicholas Owen, of course. The authorities continued to search for Catholic priests up and down the country. These searches could go on for many days, and I won't bore you with any more details about that, but there's a lot more information. So 4th of October 1597, Father John Gerard escaped from the Tower of London along with a colleague, and astonishingly their jailer, who would have been punished for their escape as well, because basically he was in on it. But he had to escape with them as well, because otherwise he would have been executed for letting the priest escape. So he wanted to be a Catholic, and he escaped with them. They climbed down from the tower on a rope, so run diagonally from the towers, the cradle tower, down to a boat on the river. And the escape was almost certainly planned by Anne Vaux and Nicholas Owen. It was Anne who actually, from the previous picture of the house, who pretended to be a sister and was very indignant towards the pursuivants. One time she was arrested, a little bit later on, a few years later, and she laughed in the face of her accusers and interrogators and said, "You've got nothing on me at all." She really had no fear at all. And she dedicated her life to work with the Jesuits. She never married. She spent her money, her life working for them. And she had read houses in London and various places. She did a lot of the planning, writing letters, organising things. She was absolutely central to the story. And of course, Nicholas Owen with his practical skills. So he got her brains and his sort of practical skills, and you put them together, and you got the great escape, basically, of this priest. Anyway, so Hindlip, I mentioned, there was a centre of operations in Worcestershire, the Welsh Marches. Home of Humphrey's friend Thomas Habington, and so on. Jesuit Alcorn arrived in 1590, and so on. So it kind of gives you a flavour, really, of what was going on. This is a picture of Hindlip. This is a sketch of what Hindlip would have been like before it burned down. It was a terrible fire. And so it's a typical sort of Tudor mansion. You can see all these wonderful Tudor chimneys and so on. There would have been lots and lots of priest hides there, probably as many as Harvington Hall. What a shame it didn't survive, because it would have been amazing. And the West Mercia Police Headquarters is on the site of that now. So, kind of an irony there, really, I suppose. James I. So, comes to the throne, a very bad man, really. I mean, he played a double game. Before he became king, when he was up in Scotland, a group was sent up there to talk to him and sort of ask him, will you be nice to Catholics? Will you be, how will you treat Catholics? And he said, yeah, that's fine. I've no problem with Catholics at all. And he lied like anything, because as soon as he got power, and especially after the Gunpowder Plot, he was a wicked torturer and enemy of Catholics completely. We know about the Guy Fawkes and so forth, the Catesby and all the rest of that stuff as well from legends. Anyway, 1603, James VI of Scotland becomes James I. Things got worse for Catholics, not better. They thought they were going to get better, and at first it was okay, but 3 years later, Owen and 3 priests, 2 of whom had been involved in the so-called Gunpowder Plot, were surprised by pursuivants at Hindlip, in Worcestershire. They bolted into 2 priest hides I mentioned that Owen had already constructed, and so forth. So, yeah, pursuivants basically searched for them. With discovery imminent, Owen gave himself up in the hope of distracting attention from the priest. At least that's a supposed thing. Nobody knows for absolute certain. But it was to no avail. All 4 were uncovered, and Owen's capture in particular was widely celebrated because they wanted him, because he knew where the hides were. He knew exactly where he'd built them, or where other people had built them. He knew where the priests were being hidden. He knew an awful lot of information, but they could not get the information out of him. They tortured him. They hung him up by his wrists, which was their favourite one, for hours on end, absolute excruciating agony. But he still didn't tell them the information. But he had a hernia. So his intestines were in danger of bulging straight out. So basically they put an iron plate, strapped an iron plate to hold the intestines in. And it was that killed him, because basically it punctured him, it caused puncture wound, and he basically bled to death, which is a horrible death, really. Secretary of State Robert Cecil said, "It is incredible how great was the joy caused by his arrest," Nicholas Owens, "knowing the great skill of Owen in constructing hiding places and the innumerable quantity of dark holes in which he had schemed for hiding priests all over England." So they thought, Eureka, we've got him. But they didn't get any information. So it didn't do them any good. These are sort of examples of the sort of things that, this is like a sort of cupboard arrangement, basically, you can see. And sometimes it would have a thing that would hinge upwards like that. It was a great one for hinges, doors hinging one way or the other, or things like that. So on the outside it looks a bit like that, but inside it opens up. So, and there's several accounts of ones being like that. So that was kind of one of his, where this is at Salford Manor, Salford Prior. But unfortunately, as I say, some of them, like in the village where I live, has been lost since then. At Tusmore, nearby, there was recorded as a priest hide. I think it was in the Great Hall. It was a seat that lifted up, and there was a passageway going downwards, apparently, but the house has been long since lost, so we don't know anything much more about that than from contemporary records, really. And that would be the map. I can't show it to you, but that is, if you click on that, that actually will get you to the digital map of priest hides and where they are located in England, and where supposed ones are also there, according to records. So some are definitely genuine ones like Harvington, and some are from various records and documents and letters and things like that. But many of whom have been lost. So it's an excellent map as well that which will actually show you, but anyway, I can't show you, unfortunately. So Owen was a brave man. His body was not built to withstand the torture, though. They hung him by his wrists, added weights to his feet as well, and strapped an iron plate to his stomach to keep the intestines from falling out, basically. But he died disemboweled, having provided his captors with no useful information at all. Privy Council, finding itself somewhat embarrassed at having tortured to death a disabled prisoner, claimed he committed suicide, but this was met with public disbelief. So they said they gave him a blunt knife to eat his food with, and somehow with the blunt-ended knife he stabbed himself in his abdomen and pulled out his own. I mean, it's just like a fanciful story that they made up, because they didn't want to say, because they weren't meant to. They weren't meant to torture people at all. But they definitely weren't meant to torture disabled people, and they did torture disabled people because they didn't get less who they tortured. But it was bad publicity for them, and a lot of people had a lot of sympathy for these priests and the people who were hiding them. So it was very bad publicity for the Privy Council, and they sort of made out that he committed suicide, which, given the fact he was a Catholic, is incredibly unlikely. Plus also, how would he kill himself with a blunt knife? It didn't make any sense. It was obviously a blunt knife. They wouldn't give him a shot in case he stabbed a jailer. That was probably the fear, and so on. And this is an example of what they might have done. Sort of, these are pictures afterwards anyway. So we've got the rack here, for example, and hanging them. So this was their favourite one, was hanging them from their wrists, adding weights to their feet for 4, 5, 6 hours at a time until they passed out, then getting them down, reviving them, putting them back up. And this is what they did to many of these priests and so on. And as we know, hanging, drawing and quartering, like Campion, for example, was a hideous death as well anyway. I won't go into the details of that, which was appalling, really. So anyway, Venetian ambassador wrote home, public opinion holds that Owen died of the tortures inflicted on him, which was so severe they deprived him not only of his strength, but the power to move any part of his body. So basically they tortured him so that he just couldn't function really at all. So the explanation of his death was even more strange, considering that he was committed to his faith and the cause for priests in England. As Father John Gerard later commented in his autobiography, they added calumny to murder, and that they had tortured him cruelly. Gerard comments that if Owen had not injured his neighbour by revealing secrets that could harm them, he certainly would not offend God by self-murder, suicide, concluding that the day of judgment will refute this calumny as well as others. So the authorities said, yeah, he killed himself with a blunt knife, and the Catholics knew it was all lies. He was buried in the grounds of the Tower of London. He was the immediate occasion of saving the lives of many hundreds of persons, both ecclesiastical and secular. It is true that many priests must have owed him their lives, and many Catholic families were able to receive the sacraments from a priest because of the work of this man. He was beatified by Pope Pius XI in 1929 and canonised by Pope Paul VI as one of the 40 martyrs of England and Wales in 1970. Of course, nearly all the 40 martyrs of England and Wales are men. How many are women? Not many. So, an interesting point there. His feast is celebrated on the 23rd of January in the Diocese of Birmingham and 22nd of March elsewhere. And there is a church dedicated to him in Lancashire too. There is today quite an interest in the Tudor houses in which St Nicholas Owen built priest hides, and some are tourist or pilgrimage sites such as Oxborough Hall in Norfolk, Speke Hall near Liverpool, Baddesley Clinton, Harvington Hall in the Midlands. Visitors can crawl into the priest hides and see how it would have felt. I wouldn't recommend it, it's very small. Phil, who runs Harvington Hall, has actually gone inside a priest hide for 24 hours, 36 hours. It's very, very claustrophobic. It's very unpleasant. So he's done sort of like video thing from inside the priest hide in the dark at night and things like this. It's well worth watching, but it's, you know, pretty horrific, really. It's like being buried in a tomb. From a place of desperate refuge, it has become a highlight on a day trip or pilgrimage. Next time you're visiting a Tudor house and you're shown a priest hide, spare a thought for Nicholas Owen, for his ingenious work and for the horrific and painful death for his steadfast faith. Father Henry Garnet said of him, "I verily think no man can be said to have done more good for all those who laboured in the English vineyard. He was the immediate occasion of saving the lives of many hundreds of persons, both ecclesiastical and secular." So there we are. That was John Gerard's take on it, basically, from the autobiography of Elizabethan priest. Anyway, it's been reprinted since with a slightly different title. I've got the original edition, 1951 one. And there's a supposed picture of Nicholas Owen. And there's some sort of pictures which are St. Joseph the worker and St. Nicholas. So he's a bit like St. Joseph in the sense of carpenter and worker and so on. So it's depicted with a hammer and a saw and things of that sort, tools of his trade. You probably didn't look anything like that at all, really. But anyway, I hope that was an interesting little talk, anyway.